Most stories about Challenger end in 1986. The investigation, the memorial service in Houston, Reagan's poem, the images of the crew, the images of the families, fade to black. That's where the Netflix documentary ends. That's where most books end. That's where the story lives in the memory of most people who were old enough to watch it happen. This episode is what came after that fade to black. And I want to tell you up front, it's a better story than the one most of us have been carrying. Not better in the sense of painless. The loss was real, and nothing that came after erases it. Better in the sense that it doesn't end in defeat. It ends in something that looks, if you're paying attention, like a promise being kept. My name is Sarah Bagby. This is the final episode of The Mission Continues. Let me tell you what Barbara Morgan did in the weeks and months after January 28, 1986. She went home to McCall. She went back to her classroom. She taught second grade. She also traveled around the country to schools and education conferences and community organizations, talking about the Teacher in Space program, about what Christa McAuliffe had stood for, about what the mission still meant. She did this while grieving. She did this while the investigation was ongoing and the news was full of technical analysis and congressional hearings. She did it because she believed the education mission wasn't finished. In her 2011 NASA Johnson Space Center oral history interview, Morgan described what that period actually felt like from the inside. NASA had asked her to continue on after the disaster as the Teacher in Space designee, to carry on the work that Christa had been doing, and to fly at some point in the future. And she said yes. And then she and NASA combined her schedule with Christa's schedule, so they weren't letting everyone down that Christa had been scheduled to visit. Think about that for a moment. She was covering Christa's appointments, going to the events that Christa would have attended, standing in front of audiences that Christa would have addressed. The lesson was different now. Rather than sharing the joy and wonder of spaceflight and Christa's new perspectives, it became, in her words, how do you recover when bad things happen? And how do you move forward? She described it as a tough, very sad time for everybody, and that teachers were dealing with something they had never dealt with before. One day in Washington, she ran into astronaut Dick Truly. He told her, "This stuff is tough, but it's easy to do if you do the right thing. And you'll know what the right thing is." She held on to that. NASA didn't cancel the Teacher in Space program immediately after the disaster. The program was suspended while the agency dealt with the investigation and the return to flight. But Morgan retained her status as Teacher in Space designee. She continued to receive annual astronaut physicals to maintain flight readiness. She continued to work with NASA on educational outreach. For years, she held a position that technically still existed, even though the mission it was built around had no flight date on the calendar. Think about what that required of her. Every year, she went into a NASA clinic and let doctors check whether she was still physically qualified to fly in space. On a program with no current assignment, no clear destination, she did that for 12 years because she believed the destination was still out there. That's not passive waiting. That's active faith. And she wasn't the only one carrying the mission forward. In her oral history, she was direct about something the dominant public narrative had almost entirely missed. A lot of people thought that when we lost Challenger, that was the end of the Teacher in Space program, she said. And that simply was not true. The flights were put on hold, but it was not the end of the program. The other 112 Teacher in Space finalists, the space ambassadors, remained active. They went back to their states and their classrooms and their communities and kept doing the work. Many of them to this day, she said, are still designing and creating and providing excellent aerospace education activities and programs in their schools, states, and regions. NASA had come looking for one teacher, and it found a national network. And that network held together even after the disaster and the dominant narrative treated as the program's ending. At some point during those 12 years, NASA took a quiet institutional step that almost nobody noticed. It established the Teaching in Space office inside the astronaut office, not a separate education program housed somewhere else, inside the astronaut corps itself. As internet access expanded in schools and as satellite dishes multiplied, the educational opportunities that had been possible only for a handful of students and schools in 1985 became available to classrooms across the country. The mission had not only survived, it had found new infrastructure. The Rogers Commission report, released in June 1986, was damning. It documented not just the technical failure of the O-ring seals, but the organizational failures that allowed a known risk to be dismissed. Engineers had raised warnings about the O-rings in cold temperatures. Those warnings had been filtered, minimized, and overridden by managers under schedule pressure. Diane Vaughn, a sociologist who spent years studying the disaster, called this process the normalization of deviance. It's what happens when an organization gradually accepts warning signs as normal, because the warning signs keep appearing and nothing catastrophic happens. And so the organization concludes they are not really dangerous until the day they are. NASA reformed. It reorganized safety review processes. It changed how concerns could be raised and by whom. It took years. And at the same time, the agency was quietly reconsidering the question of civilian spaceflight. The Teacher in Space program had been built around the payload specialist model, a civilian who flew as a participant rather than a fully trained astronaut. Shorter training, narrower preparation, a seat in the mission rather than full integration into the crew. After Challenger, NASA decided that model couldn't continue. But here's the crucial distinction. That's not the same thing as canceling the education mission. What NASA was actually saying was, we're not going to put teachers into space as short-term participants. We're going to do something more rigorous, more permanent, more meaningful. We're going to make teachers into astronauts. But that decision didn't happen overnight, and the road from 1986 to 1998 was not a straight line. Morgan described these years with a quiet understatement. NASA had told her she'd have a flight sometime in the future, and several times she got the call, "It will probably be about a month or two," they'd say, "so you might want to think about getting ready." She and her family would start lining up storage, start preparing for a move from McCall to Houston, and then it would fall through. That happened a few times, she said. She didn't say it bitterly. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you describe something you've made your peace with. It was interesting how it would happen, she noted, depending on what was going on politically, I'm sure. What finally moved things was an unexpected catalyst, John Glenn. When Glenn was preparing to fly aboard STS-95 in 1998 as a payload specialist, the former senator, the original Mercury astronaut, returning to orbit at 77, it reopened a conversation at NASA that had been sitting unresolved. If the agency was flying a non-career astronaut again, some people started asking, what about the commitment we made to the teachers? There was a lot of discussion about, wait a minute, we had a commitment to the teachers and to fly a teacher when we started flying again, she recalled. Morgan got a call from NASA Administrator Dan Golden and George Abbey, the director of Johnson Space Center. The message was direct. It's time to come. Come down, fill out the paperwork, and apply. She applied and was selected. In January 1998, NASA made an announcement that most of the country missed. Barbara Morgan, who had been the teacher in space backup designee for 12 years, was being selected as a NASA mission specialist astronaut candidate. Full training, full professional status, a career astronaut, not a participant. NASA Administrator Dan Golden was direct about what this meant. One of the issues I personally had with the civilian and space program, he said, was the lack of full training. That's why Morgan is going to become a fully trained mission specialist. Listen carefully. He wasn't saying the experiment failed, we're abandoning it. He was saying the goal was right. The approach needed to change. Morgan moved to Houston. She began the full astronaut candidate training program, jets, underwater spacewalk simulation, shuttle and station systems, technical assignments in the astronaut office. Everything every other candidate did. In her 40s, while carrying the knowledge of what she had seen in 1986. And she carries something else too. Christa, she said, was such a hands-on kind of teacher. She represented the best of teaching, and we tried to preserve and honor that in what we were doing when 1998 finally came around. In 2002, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe announced the Educator astronaut project. This was the formal institutionalization of what had begun with Morgan, a program specifically designed to select classroom teachers, put them through full astronaut training, and integrate them permanently into the Corps, not one-time participants, as career astronauts who happen to have spent years in front of students before they got to Houston. The mission was the same. The structure had been completely transformed. In 2004, NASA selected its first formally designated Educator astronauts as part of Astronaut Group 19. Joe Acaba, Rick Arnold, and Dottie Metcalf Lindberger. Each one of them had been a classroom teacher. Each one of them gave up that classroom to move to Houston and train as a full-time astronaut. On August 8, 2007, Space Shuttle Endeavour lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, carrying mission specialist Barbara Morgan to orbit. 21 years and 7 months after standing at the launch pad and watching Challenger go up and not come back, Barbara Morgan left the Earth. She was 55 years old. She had seen 2 space shuttle disasters. The mission was STS-118. It was a construction flight, new truss segments, 4 spacewalks, equipment transfers. Morgan worked as a mission specialist, a robotic arm operations, crew coordination, technical assignments. Not as a passenger, not as a guest, as the crew. And there's one more thing about that mission worth passing on. Christa McAuliffe had prepared a lesson called Where We've Been, Where We're Going, and Why. It was going to be a history lesson. Christa was a social studies teacher, and she was going to talk about the arc of human spaceflight and where humanity was heading. As a prop, she was going to bring something into orbit, something physical for her students to look at while she talked. A little model. A model of a space station Freedom. That station didn't exist in 1985. It was a design. It was a drawing. It was a concept on paper inside NASA offices. Space Station Freedom was just a model back then, Morgan said. It was on paper. It was still in the design phases. Christa was going to hold up that little plastic model and say to the children watching from their classrooms, "This is where we are going next." She never got to give that lesson. But in 2007, Barbara Morgan flew to the International Space Station, the real one, assembled in orbit, built by 16 nations over a decade, aboard Endeavour, the shuttle that replaced Challenger, the shuttle that was named by school children. To progress from something that was a model and that was strictly American in 1986, Morgan said, to this truly international space station and actually have the modules and systems up there, launched, and all assembled in orbit was a huge transformation in what seemed to me to be a very short time frame. 22 years. A little plastic model in a teacher's hand in 1985, and then the real thing, enormous, international, permanent, outside the window. This is not a footnote to Christa McAuliffe's story. This is the completion of it. While on orbit, Morgan spoke with students on the ground through a live audio connection, answering questions about weightlessness, about what Earth looks like from 220 miles up, about what it feels like to float to a window and look down. The original mission finally taking place. The coverage of STS-118 was real but measured. The New York Times noted that former teacher and space backup had finally reached orbit. The Orlando Sentinel covered it. No saturation coverage, no nationwide classroom broadcasts, no television wheeled into schools across the nation, no morning talk shows. And here's something worth sitting with. That contrast between the way the country watched STS-51L and the way it barely registered STS-118 is simply not a failure of public attention. In a strange way, it's evidence the program succeeded. Morgan wasn't covered as a symbol. She was covered as an astronaut. She had earned that. She was there not as a representative of a classroom, but as a professional crew member. In 1986, the country watched a teacher going to space. In 2007, it watched an astronaut who had once been a teacher. The emotional architecture had changed entirely. Quiet fulfillment doesn't generate headlines, but it matters, historically, and to the story of what this program actually was. McAuliffe had prepared a series of hands-on science demonstrations to conduct from the shuttle's middeck, filmed and broadcast to television classrooms nationwide. Magnetism, Newton's laws of motion, liquids in microgravity, effervescence, simple machines, hydroponics. She had designed them with real academic care. Teacher guidebooks had been distributed. Thousands of classrooms had already incorporated the activities into their curricula. Those lessons were never taught. The mission ended 73 seconds after launch. In 2017 and 2018, Educator astronauts Joe Acaba and Ricky Arnold, while stationed aboard the International Space Station, completed and filmed those demonstrations. The experiments McAuliffe had designed 31 years earlier were finally conducted in space, recorded, distributed, made available online as a free educational resource under the title Christa McAuliffe's Lost Lessons. The lessons she never got to teach were taught 31 years later from space by two educators who had become astronauts specifically because of the mission she had started. Joe Acaba, the elementary school teacher from California who applied to the Educator astronaut project in 2004, completed full training, flew multiple missions on the International Space Station, and in February 2023 became NASA's chief of the astronaut office, the highest operational position in the agency's human spaceflight program. The chief of the astronaut office, held by a former elementary school teacher. Those who can do, those who can't teach. Tell that to the chief of the astronaut office. And then there's the Challenger Center, founded by the crew's families in 1986. It built a network of simulation-based learning centers across the country and around the world. Morgan shared a story, a young woman who, as a 10-year-old, had done mission simulation at a Challenger Learning Center in New Jersey, grew up to become a satellite engineer for a major aerospace company. She traced the path directly back to that one afternoon. One afternoon, one simulation, one 10-year-old who decided in that room which direction she wanted to go. That's what the Challenger families built. Not a monument, not a place to go and feel sad. A launch pad. I want to make sure we don't leave any of the Educator astronauts' achievements out, because each of them is part of this story. In March 2009, Joe Acaba and Ricky Arnold flew together aboard STS-119, delivering the final set of solar arrays to the International Space Station and conducting spacewalks. They weren't observers. They were doing critical mission work. Spacewalks, robotic operations, construction tasks, while also being the people that NASA had specifically recruited from classrooms because it believed that teachers belonged in the astronaut corps. In April 2010, Dottie Metcalf Lindberger flew aboard STS-131. She had been a high school geology and astronomy teacher in Vancouver, Washington. On the mission, she operated the station's robotic arm, coordinated spacewalks, and helped transfer 6 tons of supplies to the ISS. She was, by every measure, an Educator astronaut. 4 Educator astronauts, multiple flights, spacewalks, robotics, critical mission roles, all of them teachers who became astronauts because NASA decided after Challenger that the right answer wasn't to abandon the idea of educators in space. It was to take it more seriously. And here's one more piece of this story that belongs here. Ron McNair, the mission specialist who died aboard Challenger, had grown up in Lake City, South Carolina. As a young boy, he tried to check out books in the public library. The library was segregated. He was turned away. He went on to earn a doctorate in physics from MIT and become only the second African American to fly in space. After his death, Congress created the Ron E. McNair Post-Baccalaureate Achievement Program, a federally funded initiative that supports first-generation college students and students from underrepresented groups who are preparing for graduate school. Research opportunities, mentoring, academic community, the kind of sustained support that makes the difference between a student who almost makes it to a doctoral program and one who gets there. That library that turned away young Ron McNair is now named after him. History has a long arc, and sometimes if you're paying attention, you can watch it bend. I started this project because I was sitting in a 4th grade classroom in 1986, and I thought the story ended there, in that silence, in the image on the screen. I was wrong. Barbara Morgan flew. Christa's lessons were taught. 3 more educators became astronauts, and one of them even led the entire astronaut corps. The families of the Challenger crew built a network of learning centers that has reached millions of students. The Teacher in Space program didn't end in disaster. It transformed, slowly, quietly, without the fanfare that surrounded its beginning. If you were sitting in a classroom on January 28, 1986, I want you to know that. The silence you felt that morning was real. The loss was real. The grief that followed was real. And the mission continued. I'm Sarah Bagby. Thank you for listening to The Mission Continues.